Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series on violence against women and girls. Today, we'll be talking about enculturated violence, violence every day and everywhere, and feminist responses to that violence. Um, I welcome you on behalf of the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment. Um, At Fielding Graduate University, the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment is pleased to have sponsored this series and to be likely sponsoring another series in the spring. A little bit about WING before we begin. As you can see on your screen, we are dedicated to gender empowerment to impact change. That's an important connection for us. And the weaving of local, regional, and international initiatives to create that change, to affect ecosystems, to create collaboration, and to be scholar activists. In particular, we are interested in the areas of education, poverty, healthcare, environment, violence prevention, equality, and globalization. We are an affiliate of the UNDPI and are pleased today to have with us three rather distinguished panelists, as well as our distinguished moderator, who will be making brief presentations and then who will engage in conversation both with each other and also in response to your questions. Meet our panel. Our moderator is Fielding Graduate University faculty member Margot Okazawa-Ray, a person experienced in both international and domestic issues, a feminist who has written and spoken about intersectionality and the connections between violence and militarism. Mimi Omerod is a faculty member in Fielding's clinical psychology program. I will tell you more about her in a moment. Tama S. Bryant Davis is associate professor at Pepperdine University. And Monica Johnson Hostler comes to us from North Carolina and the Coalition Against Sexual Assault. As I mentioned, Mimi is a faculty member at Fielding. She is also chair of the Adolescent Girls Committee and a member of the executive committee for APA's Division 35, the Society for the Psychology of Women. She has been an associate editor for the Psych of Women Quarterly. She's an expert on sexual harassment in the workplace and has consulted to the Department of Defense. Her areas of professional interest are sexual harassment and discrimination in the schools, workplace and military, and racial ethnic harassment and discrimination in military and civilian workplaces. Tama is associate professor of psychology at Pepperdine University. She's past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women and a former APA representative to the United Nations. She is currently the director of Culture and Trauma Research Lab and associate editor of the journal Psychological Trauma. She's the author of several books, including Thriving in the Wake of Trauma and Surviving Sexual Violence. She has a private practice in Los Angeles, working with individuals, couples, and families. Her doctorate is from Duke University, and her postdoctoral training was at Harvard Medical Center. Monica Johnson Hostler is the executive director of the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, where she has been since 1999. Before that, she provided direct services to survivors at Scotland County Rape Crisis Center. She's been working for 18 years to end sexual and domestic violence, both on the local and national level. She is current board president of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence advocating for federal policy and legislative change. She serves on various boards and committees, and most recently was elected to the Wake County School Board. Um, Margot, I don't know if you'd like to say a few words before we begin with Mimi's presentation.
Yes, let me first of all thank everyone for coming and just let you know that this is the third in our series. In the first session, we covered some of the angles around the kidnapping and violence of the Chibok girls by Boko Haram. The second session, we looked at the issue of military violence and specifically in Bosnia during the war there and the attempted genocide by the Serbs and using women as a weapon of war. And also in the second session, we talked about trafficking, both domestic and international trafficking of particularly girls, but both boys and girls, and the sexual harassment, violence, etc., associated with that. So the session today is to bring it closer to home, that is to more of a U.S. context. And we have some three fabulous speakers, so I'll just turn everything over to them, and we'll begin with Mimi, who will be talking about sexual harassment.
Well, thank you, Anna and Margot. I'll start with harassment in the schools. Next slide, please. In the U.S., sexual harassment in the schools is a form of sexual discrimination and is prohibited under Title IX of the Education Amendment of 1972. This is the law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex for all schools that receive federal funding. In essence, sexual harassment in the schools is defined as an unwanted sexual behavior that interferes with a student's right to receive an equal education. Next slide. Sexual harassment behaviors can be categorized as gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention, and sexual coercion. Gender harassment involves a broad range of verbal and nonverbal behaviors that are not aimed at sexual cooperation. Rather, gender harassment conveys sexist, degrading, and misogynistic attitudes about one's gender. It can include things like sexual comments or jokes, gestures, sexually explicit materials, calling students sexually charged names, spreading rumors, and it can also include harassment based on not conforming to gender norms. Unwanted sexual attention refers to a wide range of verbal and nonverbal behavior that is offensive, unwanted, and unreciprocated. Examples are unwanted touching or repeated unwanted requests for a romantic or sexual relationship. Finally, sexual coercion is trying to gain sexual cooperation based on threats or bribes. Thus, you can see that sexual harassment in the schools can include physical contact, verbal, written, or other non-physical actions, and it can take place in person or electronically, such as cyber harassment. Next slide, please. The literature often treats sexual harassment as a type of bullying. However, sexual harassment and bullying have different definitions and are regulated by different laws. The small amount of research done on the overlap between the two supports that they are different occurrences. For example, sexual harassment tends to be more prevalent around and after puberty, whereas bullying occurs throughout childhood. Research also suggests that harassment based on sex or gender may be associated with worse health outcomes than bullying. The bullying literature is less likely to consider the socio-cultural influences of sex and gender on bullying dynamics. Therefore, it's important not to conflate the two terms. Rather, we can better address sexual harassment and bullying by considering them as separate but likely related occurrences. Next, please. Sexual harassment and boys reporting high levels of harassment. For example, in a national study, 88% of girls and 83% of boys reported experiencing harassment at least once while they were in school. peer-to-peer sexual harassment is far more common than adult to student. However, even though sexual harassment is commonplace for all students, it can't be considered gender neutral. Indeed, gender is a critical aspect of understanding the issue. For example, the rates for girls exceed those for boys for both peer harassment and harassment by school personnel. Girls also receive more physically intrusive and intimidating forms of harassment, such as being touched in an unwelcome way, or being physically intimidated in a sexual way, or being forced to do something sexual. Girls also perceive sexually harassing experiences as more harmful and upsetting than do boys. Finally, girls also have worse outcomes overall. Next slide, please. Peer sexual harassment in the schools is associated with negative educational, psychological, and health outcomes for students. Examples of negative educational outcomes include school withdrawal, such as dropping class or drops in grades, paying less attention at school, skipping classes. Behavioral consequences can include attempts to manage the harassment or avoid the harasser by quitting activities or avoiding certain locales. The psychological consequences include increases in mental health symptoms as well as negative self-evaluations such as embarrassment, fear, feeling less self-confident. And the health outcomes associated with sexual harassment may include physical symptoms such as nausea, changes in appetite, headaches, and nervousness. These consequences can persist over time as well. A recent national study did not find differences in the prevalence of sexual harassment among students of different racial ethnic groups. However, it's important to consider the intersection of race and gender when studying sexual harassment, because harassment may affect different racial ethnic groups differently. For example, African American students are more likely than white students to stop doing an activity or sport, get into trouble at school, or find it hard to study because of sexual harassment. Next slide, please. It turns out that there is an important connection between school climate and sexual harassment. A majority of students perceive that their school is not adequately preventing or addressing sexual harassment, and that lack of teacher attention is linked to a hostile climate. Not surprisingly, very few students report to their teachers or counselors that they have been sexually harassed, less than 10%. In my research on sexual climate, we looked at student perceptions about whether girls are taken seriously when they complain to school officials about harassment, whether it's safe for the girls to complain, and whether the harasser receives some form of discipline. What we find is that when students believe that their school officials ignore girls' harassment complaints, that there are harmful outcomes for both girls and boys. Our findings are important because they suggest that when girls are harassed and students perceive that their school does nothing to stop the harassment, it has negative educational, psychological, and health consequences for all students, regardless of gender. It also suggests that the damaging effects of sexual harassment extend beyond those who are directly harmed by it to other students in the environment. Next slide, please. Although prevention efforts can come from all members of a school community, research in the schools suggests that prevention efforts from top administrators, such as principals, are the most effective in determining success in reducing and preventing harassment. School administrators can commit to addressing harassment, create and publicize harassment policy and reporting mechanisms, such as appointing a Title IX coordinator who is well trained and has the time and resources dedicated to handling sexual harassment and other gender issues. Perhaps most importantly, however, the sexual harassment policy has to be enforced and harassers must receive appropriate consequences. Teachers and counselors can be role models for students by behaving in respectful ways and challenging discriminatory comments, gender stereotyping, and joking. They can create codes of conduct for their classrooms that prohibit sexual harassment and hold students accountable. They can also incorporate harassment issues into the curriculum. For example, Jennifer Martin noticed that after teaching women's studies and empowerment classes to girls and boys in the high school, that the culture of her school became less tolerant of sexual harassment. For students, one of the most important responses to being harassed, or not important, but one of the most common responses to being harassed is doing nothing or ignoring it. However, this is unlikely to stop the harassment. Students can seek help from teachers, report harassers, and stand up to the harasser in non-harassing ways. They can also take action in various ways, including creating a respect or a stop harassment campaign. One example is that students can work with others to learn how to conduct a safety audit in and around their school to determine where harassment is occurring and what might prevent it. This information can then be shared with the principal and school-wide. We didn't talk much about cyber harassment, but it typically happens outside of school hours and on electronic equipment purchased or owned by parents. This suggests that parents are in an excellent position to address cyber harassment with their student. Let's now turn to sexual harassment at work. The legal definitions of sexual harassment in the workplace are based on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's guidelines. For sexually harassing behavior to be considered illegal in the workplace, it must involve quid pro quo or hostile work environment. Quid pro quo is that behavior which most people are familiar with. It requires an attempt to coerce an individual by threatening his or her employment status. A hostile work environment, by comparison, exists when the environment is intimidating, hostile, or offensive enough such that a reasonable person would be negatively affected by the environment. In looking at the harassment of women workers, the average incidence rate is about 58%. However, rates vary by work setting, with military samples typically experiencing the highest incident, around 69%, and government samples the lowest, somewhere in the 43% range. When considering the type of harassment, gender harassment is by far most common, followed by unwanted sexual attention and then sexual coercion, and women experience far more sexual harassment than men. In the next slide, we look at the consequences of sexual harassment at work. And sexual harassment in the workplace, like at school, has been linked to detrimental health and psychological outcomes. However, for women at work, it's also associated with drops in job satisfaction, organizational commitment, job productivity, and is related to a higher job turnover rate. From an organizational perspective, sexual harassment is thought to arise from a climate that tolerates the harassment of its employees and a masculine job context. Organizations where leaders do not take action in response to sexual harassment, in that they don't investigate complaints, they don't enforce existing policy, or provide penalties to harassers, these environments are associated with higher rates of sexual harassment. So what can be done about harassment at work? Policy and training related to sexual harassment are necessary for establishing an ethical organizational climate. Unfortunately, they're insufficient on their own to prevent harassment. Policy and training must be followed by action. Leaders need to set a standard where harassing behaviors are considered unacceptable, where harassment is addressed when it occurs, and where resources are offered to the targets. Leaders can also create gender balance in the workplace and reduce stereotyping based on gender, race, ethnicity, and other social identities. Leaders can also reduce masculine culture and power asymmetries, such as using language that does not evoke gender-associated characteristics, and they can minimize sexual joking, and they can emphasize accountability. When leaders create work environments that value interpersonal cooperation rather than competition and reduce social hierarchy based on gender, this may also reduce harassing behaviors in the workplace. So as we can see, it's critical critically important for both schools and the workplace that those who are in positions of power directly take action to prevent sexual harassment and address it when it does occur. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mimi. And a rhetorical question before we move to the next slide, to Tema, I'm sorry, is what happens when the harasser or the perpetrator is the person in position of power? So Tema, take it away, please.
Yes, I'm so glad that you all are joining in on the line, and I invite you to take a nice deep breath in and exhale. As we're thinking about violence against women, it can be triggering for a number of feelings and a number of memories, and it's important that we take care of ourselves as we listen. I'm focused today on From the Margins to the Center, Sexual Assault of Ethnically Marginalized Women. And as a feminist scholar and practitioner, it's important for me to identify that I approach this work not only as a trauma psychologist and a trauma scholar, but also as a survivor myself. It's also important that while sexual assault crosses all demographic lines, that there are some unique dynamics that happen for ethnically marginalized women. And if we want to effectively create change, we have to be aware of those dynamics and that context. Feminist scholar and poet Audre Lorde said, "When we speak, we are afraid, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So we might as well speak, knowing we were never meant to survive." And so by shattering the silence, we are able to survive and thrive. Next slide. There has to be a common framework when we talk about cultural context and what that means for sexual violence. We recognize that all of us come to the table with multiple identities. And so all of us are human beings, and then all of us are members of various cultural groups, and then each of us is a unique individual. And it's important that we recognize all three of those characteristics so we don't approach the work by saying things like, I don't see race, I'm a human being, or I don't identify by an ethnic group, I'm a human being. We're all human beings, and then we're all members of cultural groups, and then there are some aspects of us that are just unique to us as individuals. It's also important that when we talk about culture, race, and ethnicity, that we recognize we're not just talking about oppression, but the richness and the values and the experiences that people have that have nothing to do with discrimination, but have something to do with their cultural strengths. We also want to know that when we're working with clients or when we're doing research, the goal is not invisibility, but diversity. So it doesn't work for us to say to someone, I didn't notice that you were black, or I never noticed you were Asian, when that's a part of their identity. And so the issue is not erasure or even a melting pot, but people talk about a chunky soup where we could all be present and together in unity and working in coalition and collaboration as allies, and at the same time recognize who we are as individuals and what we bring to the table. And so along those lines, tolerance is not the goal. People want to be respected. And recognizing that our culture, our ethnicity, our race shapes our experience, interpretation, our responses, and even our recovery priorities. I also want to say that sexual assault is not just an individual experience, but for some marginalized groups, it has been used systematically as a form of intergenerational trauma, a form of oppression. And so intersectionality is important, where we look at both racism and sexism, as well as all of the types of isms and phobias that intersect women's lives. Next slide. So we want to talk about some of the specific groups. When we think about African American sexual assault survivors, we know that younger African American women are at increased risk. Those who are living with low income are at increased risk. And I want to say about low income and poverty for African Americans that African Americans are more likely to live with intergenerational poverty versus transient poverty. So transient poverty would be, we were doing okay and then I got laid off. Intergenerational poverty is when I lack, and for as far back as I know, my family has lacked, and I don't know anyone who has the resources that would assist me. We also know that partner abuse creates greater risk for sexual assault than an intimate partner violence counterparts of other ethnicities, and also HIV increases the risk of sexual assault. Next slide. We know that help is available for sexual assault survivors, but there are barriers to disclosure and barriers to help seeking. One of the great things that we have found in the research is that one of the effects, one of the protective factors for trauma recovery is not just the severity of what happens to you, but the response you get when you seek help. And so what are the things that keep some African American sexual assault survivors from seeking help? Sometimes there is a protection of and loyalty to African American men due to our history of injustice. So in the prison industrial complex, there is documented discrimination when we think about race and the response of the criminal justice system. And so some people take the response of, I don't want to turn over another brother, or I don't want to turn over another member of my community to a prison system that is already oppressive and racist. And when people have that mindset as a clinician, a part of my response is, when you report someone for sexually assaulting you, you are not the one that's betraying the community. The perpetrator is the one who's betraying the community. There's also a distrust of agencies, and so when people have not had positive experiences with the police or with judges or attorneys, they're less likely to seek help, and that also goes to mental health professionals. When they have experienced discrimination from therapists, then that creates an additional barrier. The reality is that there are lower rates of effective prosecution when you have an African American victim, that African American sexual assault survivors have been devalued, and those who violate sexual assault, who violate African American women, end up with lighter sentences. There's also fear of victim blaming. People are aware of the stereotypes that exist about their community, and so there is the stereotype of African American women as promiscuous and therefore unrapeable. And so those pieces have to be addressed in order for people to feel safe and comfortable coming forward and getting help. Next slide. For Asian American survivors, among East Asians, low maternal education increased the risk for sexual abuse, and a history of childhood sexual abuse nearly tripled the risk for adult sexual assault. And so we recognize the impact of immigration, the impact of education, and also prior victimization. Asian women who date non-Asian men are at increased risk for sexual assault, and we find this trend also for Native American women. The rate of interracial violence is higher, as opposed to when we look in other groups, the rates of intra-racial violence are higher. Next slide. So addressing some of these barriers, we have to know what are the things that keep people silent. And Asian American sexual assault survivors have the lowest rates of reporting. Asian American college students are more likely to endorse a belief that the victim precipitated the rape and holding victims responsible for the rape, and for women preventing rape. Another study found that Japanese American students were more likely to normalize sexually abusive behavior and minimize the seriousness of rape than their white American counterparts. And so sometimes there's a sense of cultural identity, and because I'm trying to hold up my cultural values, that can be used against me in terms of keeping me silent. And so there is a focus and a value placed on being able to suffer in silence, not being one who complains or creates trouble or problem, but being a source of peace. Preserving honor, not only for yourself, but your family. Not discussing one's problems outside of the family, and a belief in traditional gender roles. Next slide. Risk factors for Latinas include higher acculturation, poverty, age, older women more likely to endorse having experienced sexual assault, unemployment, increasing people's risk. And we think about this in connection to Mimi's earlier talk with sexual harassment, and those who are most vulnerable to violation and perpetration are those who are living in poverty, those who have low employment or no employment. Drug use also increases risk, and we know this is a reciprocal relationship where people are using substances in order to cope, and then the substances increase your risk for further violation. Prior victimization as well as HIV positive status also increases risk. Next slide. Barriers to help seeking include Latino college men being more likely to endorse rape myths. Traditional rigid gender roles tend to privilege men and value the silent suffering or endurance of women. While white college women were the most sympathetic to rape victims, their sympathy toward Latina victims was less than their symptoms toward white victims. And this is important to recognize because sometimes a lot of the racism literature uses this word perception, which makes it appear that it's in the person's mind, but it's not reality. But we know when we conduct studies about people's beliefs about other groups and the holding of stereotypes that these issues are very pervasive. When people are socialized that women are responsible for male sexual behavior, and we know that this happens across ethnicity, but we see higher rates within the Latino community. Socialized that a loss of virginity outside of marriage is shameful to not only the individual but their family, so that promotes silence. Language barriers, when those who are in positions to help do not have multiple languages available, in this case specifically Spanish, then that becomes an additional barrier to being able to come forward and get support. And the belief that sex is a marital obligation, and so not understanding sexual assault within the confines of marriage. And then for those who are undocumented, fear of deportation. Next slide. There are additional risk factors when we think about indigenous survivors, Native American, American Indian survivors, marital status. Those who are separated, widowed, divorced have the highest rates of sexual assault. Substance dependence, and again, this is a bidirectional relationship where people use substances to cope, and then those substances increase their vulnerability. History of childhood victimization is another risk factor. Membership in some tribes is associated with higher risk than others. And then the question of a cultural affiliation. For those who have cultural affiliation being very central to them, the risk and vulnerability can be increased in terms of a desire, as we talked about within the African American community, to protect your community and not to come forward and report it. When there is the belief that in the larger society, people already hold negative views about your community, then you feel disinclined to share when it's been a bad experience, as sexual violence is. Next slide. So some of the barriers to help seeking: mistrust of white agencies and helpers, fear of being ostracized by families, shame and guilt, concerns with confidentiality, jurisdictional confusion if people are on a reservation, racism, fear of losing one's child custody, history of inactive response of the state, language barrier, cultural values differences, lack of insurance coverage, and then the location of the helping agencies are often not directly in indigenous communities. And so all of those make it difficult for people to come forward and get help. Next slide. But we do know that healing pathways are available, and there are multiple ways that people heal. It's important to recognize even those who have not done traditional psychotherapy have often used various strategies in order to heal and work through their recovery process. So there are cultural strengths and feminist strengths that people bring to the table, and culturally congruent feminist therapy honors the strength and wisdom of survivors. Many people often also cope with spirituality, the use of ritual, and positive religious coping. So positive religious coping is the belief that there is a higher power who loves me, who believes me, who seeks my good, versus negative religious coping, which believes that the higher power is out to condemn me, out to catch me doing wrong, out to punish me. And so it's important to not only get a sense of if survivors are spiritual or religious, but what their particular perspective is in terms of it being positive or negative. Social support is very central, not only emotional social support, but instrumental social support, so the provision of resources. The use of arts and the media have been a wonderful strategy that has historically and in contemporary times been used by ethnically diverse survivors. The use of humor is also important to recognize, and that's where the life force comes from, the light and the hope in the room, to recognize that even after tragedy, there can be great triumph. It's also important to know the value of activism and resistance, that it's not just a focus on coping with horrible situations and coping with violation, but how do we create long-term, systematic, sustainable change. Community education is important because the people you're more likely to disclose to are members of your community, and we want to make sure people get a positive response. Skills building and empowerment are also key aspects of the healing process that helps us to move from surviving to thriving. And then restorative justice is necessary. If there is not a valuing of ethnically marginalized women's bodies and lives, then there will not be an appropriate response. And there has to be justice as a part of the process of healing and recovery and moving away from victim blaming. And so the last thing we note is that Lucille Clifton said, "Come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." And so we celebrate the fact that we're still here, survivors.
Oh, thank you very much, Tema. Very powerful. Another rhetorical question is thinking about, women from marginalized community, colonized communities. Where do you begin to tell the story of violence in the community? Where do you begin to tell the story? Next, we'll have our final speaker, who is Monica. Please.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for patiently listening. I know that webinars are oftentimes difficult, so hopefully both the presentation style of those of us who are panelists, but also the visual aids are really helpful and will keep you all engaged. I'll start with the acknowledgement of the first slide for me that acknowledges October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I'll just mention that the various forms of violence against women that I'll be discussing, I'll be using overarching terms, but that is inclusive of both domestic violence, which we acknowledge in October, teen dating violence, which is acknowledged in February, human trafficking, which currently to date has one day in January that we put effort to and acknowledge in April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so I just want to kind of just give that disclaimer in terms of language that I'll use, that all forms of violence against women often have very similar pathways to prevention, but also pathways to intervention. And what you've heard thus far from the panelists before me really laid out not just what those terms mean, but also how they kind of manifest themselves in lives, especially survivors that I consider marginalized survivors who are oftentimes also disenfranchised, which you also heard from our previous survivor and panelist. Next slide, please. So I'll be specifically talking a little bit about what it looks like on the ground, as I refer to it as boots on the ground, from policy to implementation. And when I talk about policy, I'm referring to not just state laws or state statutes, but also our federal laws and regulations that are oftentimes a part of state or federal laws, but also communities, towns, cities, state departments also have administrative policy that is very relevant and important to the work that those of us who still have boots on the ground who are doing both direct service and prevention work adhere to. I also want to add to this, the speaker before me mentioned, or I felt like wrapped up with talking about the stories, and I call that the narrative. And much of the policy work that I've spent the last 2 decades working on is really driven by narratives of survivors. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit and use the violence against women as a catalyst for how all of these things tie together from the previous panelists, but also both from a perspective of intervention and prevention on the ground. And so with the Violence Against Women Act, we use those narratives specifically from all survivors. And you'll note that last year the Violence Against Women Act took flight as a result of the media's response to what was termed and coined as the war on women. And what that was referring to was all forms of violence against women that I mentioned previously, domestic violence, sexual violence, dating violence, as well as human trafficking. I think that's important to note because last year the Violence Against Women Act for the first time was fully encompassing of all of those, and more specifically also encapsulated other policies that were being introduced but not moving forward, such as the Trafficking Victims Persons Act, which is known as TVPA, which is now all-encompassing as well in the Violence Against Women Act. And then there was also another very large, substantial bill called the Campus Save Act, which included regulations and policies around Title IX, which you've heard earlier regarding sexual harassment and sexual assault. And it also included and enhanced what was called the Clery Act, which determined how college campuses reported violence against women. And initially, they were only required to report sexual violence. And as a result of this now new robust piece of legislation includes domestic violence as well. And so, again, just reiterates that the personal narratives that we as advocates were hearing really drove the robust nature in which we created the Violence Against Women Act to respond to the narrative, but also to respond to what training and implementation could look like on the ground, not just for advocates, but for law enforcement and other criminal justice professionals who should be engaged in ensuring that survivors receive the support that they need, but also receive the outcomes through the criminal justice system. So I think it's also important to note that that particular piece of legislation does have a very large criminal justice focus. And in terms of implementation, implementation of policies, whether it's statutes, state or federal, or regulations, are often implemented by agencies who are oftentimes noted in these large, robust pieces of legislation or laws, often indicate who should be carrying out or implementing those. I can tell you, in generally speaking, money is given to agencies to provide some of those services, both prevention and intervention. And the Violence Against Women Act is also a funding source for many of those agencies. So currently in the United States, there's 2,200 domestic violence shelters. There's 1,300 rape crisis centers, and every state has a state coalition similar to mine, or they have a domestic violence and sexual violence coalition combined. And so I think that's important to note, that when we talk about violence against women largely here in this country, it's also important to note the vast number of resources we have. I also want to note that the Violence Against Women Act has specific funding to tribal violence against women organizations, which was very much so written and drafted based on the narrative from that community. And likewise, there's also direct funding for communities of color organizations, which are primarily thus far funding African American community-based organizations, African-based organizations, and Asian Islander Pacific specific organizations that are for and by those particular communities to respond to those survivors. And that was important as well in writing the policy to ensure the correct and appropriate organizations were absolutely a part of the implementation, that were able to respond directly to their communities. Next slide, please. So moving forward, thinking of the policy and programmatic responses and what those overlaps look like, I think it's important to note that the agencies that I was speaking of include nonprofit and non-governmental organizations such as the ones I mentioned, but it also is very much so inclusive of partnerships with the U.S. government, and oftentimes those state agencies or local agencies that are pointed out as well in policy or legislation as either the regulatory agency over those things or the partnership agencies as defined by particular states. And so an example of that would be the the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, has specific funding for both domestic violence and sexual violence. And now they're specifically looking at the campus community as well. And so in their solicitations or call for proposals, they often solidify in those documents that they're interested in having both a governmental as well as a nonprofit or non-governmental organization to work together, both from the research angle but also from the implementation side of things. I think it's also important to note that many of those directives also include ensuring that we are looking at what the current climate and culture is, and then what that work looks like in terms of the programmatic response specific to communities. And so oftentimes solicitations really are opened up for those of us on the ground to be able to do that work specific to the community that we're working in. So that allows you to be able to specifically say, we're going to work on sexual violence in K through 12, or we're going to actually look at policy development for domestic violence policies on college campuses now that that's a new initiative as a part of the Clery Act. And so many of these solicitations are often also drive partnerships. And I think I'll take a brief moment to note here that partnerships are often come from two different ways. Readily available partnerships, and so two parties come together willing and ready to work together, but also some of these solicitations that I'm mentioning also drive partnership, meaning the solicitation requires a partnership. And so I think it's important to note that when you're talking about responding to all forms of violence against women and girls, that some of those partnerships are natural and fluid partnerships, and some of those are required. And so you often see organizations working through that partnership as they develop the policy or programmatic response as it relates to the solicitation. The other thing most recently that the climate and culture has provided us with regarding violence against women is media and public service announcements. In the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a huge outpouring of response from organizations as well as companies who have not historically been engaged in the violence against women movement. I think we take that as great strides to really moving our country to a place where violence against women is no longer acceptable, and we are addressing root causes such as patriarchy that continue to perpetuate a culture that thus far still disenfranchises women and girls in a way that allows us to continue to see violence against women manifest in our country. And so one of the campaigns, as you can see on this slide, is the No More campaign. That campaign is a really interesting collaborative of corporate partners with non-governmental partners, but also state and federal government partners. This was founded by a few colleagues who were working in the corporate sector who, as a part of their corporate responsibility programs, were very focused on the time, either teen dating violence or domestic violence, and really started to work with state agencies like the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to see what their work could look like and how corporations could start to leverage their corporate responsibility in the area of violence against women. And so they partnered with the Joyful Heart Foundation, which is spearheaded and founded by Mariska Hargitay, who many people know from Law and Order, Special Victims Unit. So they started this No More campaign, and many of the PSAs include her colleagues from Law and Order, but it's absolutely expanded, as you can see on this one. Tim Gunn is also one of the media spokespeople. But No More has actually expanded itself onto our college campuses, given the climate and the environment here in the U.S. around campus sexual assault. And they are also in the midst of, many people have seen, if you watch NFL football, the responsiveness to the NFL's response and outpouring to responding to the Ray Rice video that many people have seen, and the NFL has begun to respond to that. Social media and public service campaigns have really allowed a platform for those of us who are boots on the ground to say to employers like the NFL, what's your responsibility? What does corporate responsibility look like from that perspective? And so the No More campaign was able to be used as leverage with the NFL, and now for the past Sundays and Mondays, those spots have been shown. And so that's an example of something like a media or public service campaign that's really being used as leverage by those of us who are direct service providers or state-level policy advocates on behalf of violence against women to really start to expand the scope and expand the reach of the work of ensuring that we're talking about prevention and intervention at a high-level way in which that it can engage many people both through social media but also through direct training and engagement. And so the other added piece of No More is their work with direct service providers that allows people to also have a funding mechanism to support those agencies, but also to provide volunteers and to really start to engage community members from all levels of whether you work for a corporation or you have your commitment is to violence against women through your career. The next piece in terms of policy and programmatic responses is funding. As I mentioned, the Violence Against Women Act is also a funding vehicle. So there's over $400 million attached to the Violence Against Women Act that funds several different parts of the movement from, as I mentioned, law enforcement training, prosecutors, judicial trainings, but also direct services, and really looking at what the response to survivors look like and how do you create multidisciplinary, victim-centered response to all the various forms of violence against women, and where are there similarities, but also what are those nuanced differences and how do those partners work together. And again, the tie-in of making a robust piece of legislation also a funding conduit has really been to ensure, as I mentioned in some cases, require partnership, but in many cases really was able to create strengthened partnerships in communities where communities were already working together and moving forward. And one thing I can definitely tell you as someone who's only spent their career doing violence against women through a nonprofit or non-governmental agency is funding absolutely does make the world go round, and many of our folks do this work without funding, and what funding has done is really solidified those relationships so that advocates who dedicate their life to supporting survivors are not the only people supporting and responding to survivors. And we've also seen, there be funding put towards the things that we're talking about currently that are really rising to the top, such as human trafficking. While the TVPA had existed, there had not been really funding dedicated to direct services or prevention of human trafficking. And so we've definitely seen a difference in being able to leverage the Violence Against Women Act to include this human trafficking piece of legislation that also gives accessibility to funding for both comprehensive services, but also for development of prevention efforts around human trafficking. And I think it's also important to note here that the Violence Against Women Act also now included domestic trafficking, which really looks at what trafficking looks like here on U.S. soil. The initial kind of small pilot project funding really was just dedicated to international trafficking in the U.S. And so this has really given and broadened the scope of the breadth of anti-human trafficking efforts. And so I've used and talked about prevention significantly as I've been talking, and I want to make sure that when we talk about prevention, we talk about what that really means. And, as a direct service provider and advocate, I often use terms like culture and climate, and that's largely because when we talk about prevention, we really do believe that through prevention and changing social norms, which is really changing people's beliefs and values, that we absolutely can end all forms of violence against women. But in order to do that, we're really talking about changing our culture. And I always remind people when we talk about changing social norms, we're also asking people to think about and be conscious consumers. Many things that we consume, whether it's from media to the clothing that we wear and purchase and buy, to the food that we eat, many of us have, kind of operated just purchasing or being consumers and not really thinking about what's behind what we're consuming, and are these things a part of the intersections of oppression that we consider a part of how we really look at ending violence against women, especially against women and girls. And so we're talking about the types of media that people consume and the language that's whether explicit or implicit around condoning violence against women, and really asking people to be conscious of that work. And that really is what's required to creating this huge culture shift. And so, one example we use around media is the hypersexualization of young girls, and how many people have become very sensitized, and we normalize that sex sales. And so what does that mean when we say that? And how do we make people responsible for making sure that we're able to change the culture and climate, recognizing that we live in a capitalistic society? And so money absolutely is a contributor factor to how we really talk about changing the culture so that we are moving towards ending violence against women and girls. And then programming for targeted populations. We often use bystander intervention as a very common language around prevention, and there's substantial research around using bystander intervention. And one of the things that I always point out to people, the language bystander often makes people have kind of an impulsive reaction to, oh, that means you actually want me to physically, as an individual, intervene. And absolutely that could be it, but I think it's important that people also know that bystander intervention is really calling into question for people to think about what their role is in violence against women. And all of us have a role as long as we're existing, whether it's through media, our beliefs, or the norms that we all function under, but also what role can we have in terms of ensuring that the folks around us are also engaged in ending violence against women and girls. And then we are making slower strides to actually funding prevention. This is a long-term strategy. When we talk about changing social norms or culture shift, we talk about reminding people that in order to change a culture, this is not short-term. And we're going to have to be invested in the long term, looking at how we work with partners to ensure that we are indeed shifting the culture and changing the language that we use, that you've heard my previous panelists mention the importance around making sure that we fully understand and are fully engaged in the language as we move towards prevention. And I think for me, when I talk about the work that I do and how it's a call to action for me and my
Monica, may I just interrupt for 1 second, because I know that Tema has to leave in about 3 minutes. And so I want to make sure you get the plenty of time to do this action piece. Tema, do you have any final comments before you leave us? We hate to lose you.
Well, thank you so much. I'll just say very quickly that it is important that we create an environment where we get the language out, not just to, not preaching to the choir. When I worked on a college campus around sexual violence, when we're not careful, the way we language and the way we promote prevention and educational activities, unless they're mandatory, people don't realize that it touches their lives. And so I think the use of the media and those types of campaigns is very critical in terms of touching the lives and getting connected and getting the message out there beyond those who are already supportive.
Mm-hmm. And before you go, I have one question. In your presentation, you mentioned that something about class, lower. You called it low income class. Being a risk factor, I guess. Could you clarify that? Because doesn't it make a difference if you're middle class that you don't have to go to public services, and therefore you don't end up being a statistic? So just to clarify for the audience, you're not saying if you're poor you're more likely to be abused.
Well, I think both things are true. I think that those persons who are middle and higher income are able to use private resources, and so can have lower rates of reporting, or can look like underreporting. And I would also say that persons who are lower resourced, that people will take advantage of them more. Even when we think about, I was connecting it to the talk about sexual harassment. And when people know it's not easy for you to walk away from a job, or it's not easy for you to move. When I'm working with my students about those who live in what they experience as unsafe neighborhoods, and people who don't live with poverty will say things like, why don't they just move? Well, when you don't have the resources to get out of a dangerous situation, or you don't have that instrumental social support, then you are vulnerable. You're at an increased risk as well in terms of having little options in order to get out of a place, a relationship, a job, or a community where you are more vulnerable. So both things.
Okay, thank you for the
Yeah.
clarification. I thought you were kind of leaning in the culture of poverty kind of
Yeah.
argument. So
Right.
thanks for that clarification. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and I regretfully let you go.
Oh, thank you very much. You all enjoy
Okay.
the rest of the discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Monica, let's let you finish this last section, and then there'll be time for people in the audience to ask questions. And but let's finish this up, and we'll open things up. And there's already one question, so please.
Sure, and one thing I do want to add, and I'm speaking for myself, not sure if this is what Timma was saying, but I think it's important to also note when we talk about poverty as an indicator rather than a contributing factor is I briefly kind of did a broad brush over the philosophical beliefs around a social justice model, which absolutely does look at all different forms of violence, making the survivors who may be on that concentric circle of someone who's impoverished, a person of color, who also may not be able-bodied, who also may identify as LGBTQIA, that makes them closer to being vulnerable, to being victimized. And I think, not everyone who does this work from a place of a social justice framework, but I think it's important to note that that is very much so central and a central tenet to really looking at culture shift, is acknowledging someone who is far more vulnerable because of the many forms of oppression that our country currently exists under, again, are not causes for victimization, but definitely makes those survivors far more vulnerable, or those communities more vulnerable. And Tim, talked a little bit about Indigenous and Native American folks, and I think, that's an example of having had the great opportunity to work with that community for the past couple of years on looking at not just how to be inclusive of tribal communities in responding to violence against women, but the historical perspective. And there's a great Amnesty report that actually looks at the history of sexual violence against Native people from the inception of this country to where we are today, and acknowledging this social justice framework that makes communities vulnerable.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go
move
ahead.
on to my action slide. And so, for me, this is a slide that everyone can be engaged in, no matter where they are on the spectrum of being engaged in the violence against women work, is supporting all survivors. Language, again, is very important. If people are asking questions about why did she wear that, why did she stay, those are things that are very indicative of victim blaming and continue to create a culture of silence for survivors. And I don't think people realize, Tim also mentioned this, that statistically 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 young men are victims of sexual violence. And even more so, 1 in 3 women are victims of domestic violence. And so oftentimes when you're talking to people, recognizing and owning that they're definitely survivors that you're speaking to, but also recognizing that what you say today to someone who's not a survivor could absolutely be indicative of their response if they are victimized after they've heard this victim blaming mentality that our culture still needs to change from. And using victim-centered and supportive language, acknowledging that anyone could be a survivor and that we would support anyone regardless of their identities if they are survivors, and really talking about, as I mentioned, this criminal justice response that often isn't a response to our most vulnerable populations, and start to really change that and call those things out, and calling out when people don't support it. And that, we saw this around Ferguson, Missouri, where people were very, and are still very engaged in calling out things that they feel are absolutely wrong and not acceptable, and noting that those things are happening because of the particular community that exists in. And that same thing is true for violence against women and girls. And the last thing I put on here is the girl effect. I think it's important to note that violence against women and girls, while, the series has really touched on the wide range and scope of violence against women, but recognizing the Girl Effect is a campaign that was used internationally, making a note that, supporting a girl can change this country. And so investing in girls absolutely has a worldwide global effect on not just ending violence against women and girls, but creating a culture of where all people, regardless of who they are respected and treated equally. And so I always remind people that if we support and invest in girls, then we really will begin to change the culture and build a culture and a climate where women and girls are safe and healthy.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Okay, so just a question, just directly aimed at Monica's presentation is, and this is rhetorical as well, the violence against women movement used to be radical movement. What happens when a radical movement becomes the kind of high-level, professionalized, service, policy-oriented approach that involves a high level of involvement by the criminal justice system that is recognition by the state. And so what might be both the positive, impacts of both of those, but also what might be the downsides. Thank you very much to all three presenters, and we have a couple of questions, so I'll just start with these. And the first one, I'll just say to both Mimi and Monica, maybe Mimi, since we haven't heard from you in a bit, in what ways are the service providers really centrally including the voices of the survivors and the families, I would say, in the communities that are affected, by violence?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Margot. And I'm thinking about it from a sexual harassment perspective, and I'm kind of drawing a blank, which is telling me something. I think it's telling me that we don't actually hear much from. We hear in the campaigns against sexual harassment from survivors, but in terms of service providers, we hear much more about other forms of sexual violence, which are so important as well. And so I guess I'm thinking that we need to hear more about sexual harassment, in particular because it is something that, in some ways, in some research, it happens so much more frequently, for one, and the gender harassment is clearly based on stereotypes and negative attitudes toward women and girls, that it's important to make this far more visible, I think.
Monica, any response to this question?
Can you repeat the question for me? I'm sorry. I was listening to Mimi, and then I was like, what was the question?
Oh, okay. In what ways have you seen programs really take into account centrally the voices of the survivors, right, and the communities or their families?
Yes. So I think, and again, Mimi spoke for sexual harassment, and I would absolutely say I agree. I've seen less of that for sexual harassment. Policies, I think, I've just seen a few workplace policies a little more conscientious of survivors and their stories. But as I mentioned, one of the things that's been true for looking at the response locally is it's been driven by survivors and their voices. Many organizations, while to your earlier point before our questions, are funded by federal agencies and really do partner with criminal justice agencies, the likelihood of finding organizations that are not created for and by survivors is still very rare in this movement, contrary to what I think people think now that there's funding for this. It's still very much so. It's a survivor-driven work. Every policy or practice that we create is informed by survivors' voices. I also mentioned earlier very clear kind of organizations that exist now specifically for particular communities. Those were created in response to survivors' voices.
Um, so just to push this point, though, you know, what would, and this is rhetorical, you don't really have to answer this question, and both of you, but, you know, given the scope of the problem, what would really take into, what kinds of programs and responses would actually take into account the structural inequalities and oppression, you know, which is more than just simple kind of discrimination, right? Would really take into account the systemic forces and apparatuses and mechanisms that are in place, so that, in fact, sometimes it raises the question of which victims matter and in what ways, and which perpetrators are more publicized than others, right? And when you take into account the race, class, gender pieces of that. So, you know, what needs to happen structurally? And that's what I was referencing, you know, when I was talking about the the radical origins of the anti-violence against women movement.
Margot, this is Anna, and I wanted to go back to, and I'm trying to find it and having some difficulty, but Mimi, at the end of your presentation, I think in terms of both schools and workplaces, you talked about changing the culture of those workplaces in ways that I think addresses some of what, at least it does for me, some of what Margot was talking about. Would you revisit that a bit? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes, uh, I think the questions are really interesting, Margot and Anna, and uh, and Margot, I can see you're coming from more of an activist perspective, and I think in my talk I really emphasized an organizational perspective and really hit on the point that a lot of the change in terms of organizational culture and attitudes towards sexual harassment, as well as behavior around sexual harassment, really needs to come from a top-down perspective. And this is supported by research, particularly in the working world, that without organizational leaders or CEOs, bosses, supervisors taking a very active stance about not tolerating sexual harassment, unless those positions are taken within organizations, harassment is more likely to flourish. However, Margot, I think you were talking more about a response to sexual violence coming from the community, I think. And I
Well,
think
I'm
this is
actually talking, yeah, I'm actually
yeah, go
talking about
ahead.
both, but go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, certainly there are there are a number of things, and now I'm thinking about at the student level in schools that students can do to raise awareness, as well as to, in a sense, put pressure on their school administrators to address the issue. So, so I guess in focusing on a top-down approach, that's not to suggest that we don't need we don't need to address harassment and other forms of violence against women at all different organizational levels, if you will.
Thank you. For a question for Monica, you mentioned the worldwide kind of girl effect movement. Um, the questioner says she's familiar with this girl effect in developing countries, for instance, working through microcredit investments. But do you see anything similar here in the U.S.? What would be an equivalent of the girl effect movement in the U.S.?
So I do, and I think it's very similar to this larger kind of question around activist start of this work. So a couple of things. There is a huge movement of helping organizations that exist, whether their specific goal is violence against women or just working specifically with girls, is looking at what the investment in girls look like. So we now have some violence against women organizations who that's kind of the core mission of their organization, also creating micro lending for women who have come through their services. And so creating small micro lending for them to create their own businesses. Those, I guess for me, I think most people know what's happening regarding your kind of federally funded agencies and forgetting that the violence against women movement is extremely large and diverse in terms of the work they're doing. And there's still organizations that are absolutely grassroots activist organizations who have not taken any of, as we call it, the federal funding industrial complex that exists, but don't take any of that funding, that are still doing some of that work. There are activist organizations who've also taken on the criminal justice system, or I think Tim actually used the term as well, but the prison industrial complex, and really looking at how, doing work to recognize young girls who are forced by situation, poverty, and all those other indicators we mentioned earlier that are forced into sex work. And so how do we support those girls by investing in them? And so there are several organizations who are investing into girls right here on U.S. soil to really use that as a mechanism to ending violence against women and girls.
Okay, and maybe for the book,
family, but definitely doing the work that's
okay.
relevant. Mm-hmm.
So maybe a question to the both of you is thinking about partnerships to end violence against women, whether it's with media or whoever. What do you think might be some of the more productive partnerships that could happen between those who are trying to address the issue of violence against women? Have you seen ones that are more successful than others? Like, for example, I think Mimi, it was you who mentioned, or maybe it was Monica, the public-private partnership. Are there specific kinds of those that would be more, Mimi, are there partnerships, let's say CEOs and high-level administrators of companies working with other partners somewhere? Like, could you maybe talk a little bit about that, each of you?
Well, typically sexual harassment is regulated by by the EEOC guidelines, and so although those are not always paid attention to, I guess, in workplaces, so the avenue typically. I think for women in organizations, and to probably a lesser extent girls in schools, one avenue toward addressing harassment in the workplace is a legal avenue. So which is one way, I guess. It's not a partnership, but it is one way to call attention to the issue and to try to make a change.
Okay, thank you. Monica, any idea about that?
Sure. I agree for sexual harassment. It's again mandated by law, but I think some of those partnerships that I was alluding to is really one of the things that I've worked on in partnership with a couple of other agencies is looking at low-wage workers and what sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace looks like, and how we really create policies that really speak to the environment that exists in low-wage workers like retail, fast food, and really not just looking at the policies that exist there, but actually the culture that's created. And so how can those of us who are nonprofits partner with those companies to really ensure that we're changing the culture for those employees in those businesses?
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. Since this is our last session, unless there's any other question from the audience, I'd like to just kind of pull together something I heard during the last 3 sessions, and just kind of say as way of background that it's interesting that the U.S. is the only developing, the so-called developed country, and that hasn't ratified CEDAW, which is the Convention to End Discrimination Against Women. in which there is lots of stuff about violence against women, and sort of thinking about at the national level, the Violence Against Women Act is a very internal, kind of an examination and response to violence against women in this country. So what would happen if we broaden our scope to look at violence against women and gender-based violence from a broader frame? Would we be able to take into account, for example, the relationship, between the violence against women and trafficking as a result of militarism that's happened in the former Balkans, that's happening right now in Iraq, still happening in Nigeria with, what's happening with the 1 out of 5 girls getting raped or sexually assaulted on college campuses across, this country. And so how do we make these kind of local, global connections as we address the issue of violence against women? The other thing is thinking about responses, both responses that absolutely support and, encourage and provide spaces for the survivors to heal, but what would actually constitute healing? Like, what does that actually mean? And when I think about colonialism, for example, I always ask myself, when is post-colonial end? So similarly, for survivors, when is that over? And is there such a thing? So that's another question related to the survivors. And we talk about the culture of silence, the culture of misogyny. I was somewhere where I saw in the store window, those white cotton tank top undershirts that men wear, and on it said wife beaters, right? And I guess that's a term that's both classed and gendered. But what about those cultural and religious, the ways in which religions condone violence against women? I think so. There are these cultural and institutional features of violence against women. And then ultimately, in addition to policy responses and responding absolutely in a deep way to the survivors, how do what would constitute changing a bystander culture or bystander non-intervention culture, right? Which Monica spoke very well about. So I think these are some important questions for us to move with. And what do race, class, gender, sexuality, nation have to do with the ways in which violence gets perpetrated, is addressed or not addressed, who is considered. I think Tema raised a really important point that historically certain women of color groups, probably all women of color groups have not been considered rapeable, right? That they're kind of what's the word, game, for anybody who wants to violate their bodies and so forth. So I think these are some important questions. Anna, did you want to add anything? And then we can also ask our two, Mimi and Monica, maybe to say a couple of things before we end.
Yes,
And,
thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Margot.
Go
Finish.
ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I think that it's interesting to try to keep multiple lenses open on these phenomena, because I think as you've summarized, there are local and micro manifestations both in individual lives and then macro manifestations in terms of the systems and structures which perpetuate the violence across nations, across continents, across racial and economic groups. And so it's important to not get stuck at one level or the other, but to continue to connect and traverse those boundaries. And so I think that that's been very, very helpful in the three webinars that we've had, because they internally and also across all three have struggled with that sense of both the enormity and the complexity of the issue, and at the same time that it ends up translating into a very specific manifestation in each person, often women, but each person's life. So I think that that's really helpful. I also today was struck by the fact that sexual harassment it's almost so much a part of the culture, and it's so consistent with the structures that we live within, particularly in the United States, but also around the world, that it's difficult to think about. It's almost harder to think about how to address it and change it than it is the somewhat more extreme behavior of physical violence, let's say. So I was a bit struck by that today. I've been very involved and interested in anti-sexual harassment work for decades, actually, frankly, and it amazes me how pervasive and persistent it is as kind of, and I don't mean to diminish it at all, but as kind of background noise to everything that then pops up as more extreme. So, so those are my thoughts about that. And then I will let's hear a word from Monica and from Mimi, and then I want to talk about continuing this conversation.
Go ahead, Mimi.
Oh, yes. Well, first, I just really appreciated both Tama and Monica's presentations. They were wonderful, and also that Anna and Margot, you're putting on of this series, as well as the audience members. And I do agree, Anna, that it's really critical to keep one's eye on the structural piece of all of this, and also to look at the overlaps between different types of violence. In a study with colleagues that we did, we found, and this was interesting, it was in a military academy, so it was with women trainees at the academies. We found a connection between sexual assault, sexual harassment, and stalking. And so it is important to look at the intersections of different types of violence, as well as where interventions might be most successful. So thank you.
Thank you. Monica.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mimi, and I can echo the sentiments, both Tim and Mimi. It was great to be on a panel with you all. I think everyone had such rich information, and hopefully, to Tima's point, which she, I think, left with is, oftentimes we're preaching to the choir, but I do hope that each time we're preaching to the choir that people are seeing this as their work and taking it out and expanding and remembering that, and Anna, you touched on this a bit, that many people have been doing this work for so long, and oftentimes it's very easy for sexual violence and ways to be lost and become background noise. And I'm hoping what my call to action for people is really to keep it on the forefront. And I always say to people, no matter what your work life or story is, I can always help you figure out how to integrate your role in ending violence against women and girls, and recognizing that this work in this field, this movement, is fluid, and it's constantly growing, to ensure that we're engaging people at all various levels, from the individual level to really consciously changing the culture that we live in, and looking at how this work is global, and how everything that each one of us do to end violence against women and girls is interwoven into changing the fabric of our country and our world that we all live in.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Monica, Mimi, Tama in absentia, and Margot certainly, who has been with us through all three and around all three. And I hope that you all will join us on Facebook. If you are on Facebook, Wing has a page there. Our website, we have a Ning site there on your screen, wnge.fielding.edu, where I will post the recording of this meeting, and also our website, which is part of the Fielding website, which will tell you about ongoing events, plans for the future. Don't let this be the end of your connection with Wing. Be in touch with me, be in touch with anyone on the Wing website, and continue to do the work that we need to do to change the world for the better. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
Bye. Anna, can you stay on, please?
I can.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, Monica, Mimi.
I'm trying to
Bye,
stay.
Margot. Thank you.
Okay.
I may not be able to do that, Margot. I may
You're
have
the
to.
organizer, my dear.
I know. I know. I'm trying to. Let me just see if I can do that. Go to meeting.